Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
Once called a peculiar institution, the legacy of slavery has haunted the history of the Eastern Shore. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Somerset County is at the most southern end of the Maryland Eastern Shore, and while it indulged in slavery, there was also a growing free black community. Against this backdrop, race relations in the county have been often one of bitterness and anguish. Jack Winnersten is a curator consultant at the Smithsonian Institution, an emeritus professor at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. He's written a new book examining the issue of race entitled Strange Fruit, Racism and Community Life in the Chesapeake, 1850 to the present. We have him on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So how did you come about to write this book, and your concern that perhaps this issue is not as well prominent as perhaps it should be?
I came to write this book largely because of my work as a professor at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, and as a historian I became very interested in the region, and I had published a couple of books previous to this about the Eastern Shore, especially the Chesapeake Bay.
So give me a sense about how slavery developed here on the Eastern Shore, and the fact that we obviously had a free black community all at the same time.
Slavery developed on the Eastern Shore as part of the tobacco economy at the beginning of the 18th century. But by the end of the 18th century, tobacco was sort of played out, and the Eastern Shore developed a grain economy. And even though it did no longer have a commodity culture like tobacco or cotton or rice, slavery still flourished on the Eastern Shore because slaves could be used in a variety of occupations, such as working on forges, working on grain farms, working in coal mines and things of this sort. So there was a multiplicity of uses for slavery on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, despite the fact that the old plantation system that we identify with as the Old South never really took that much of a hold.
So how did this then relate to the fact that we had this growing free black community?
Well, a lot of slaves were manumitted in the 18th and 19th century. Slaves worked themselves out of slavery to become freedom with freedom papers. And also from the 17th century onward, there was always a free black community. Free blacks antedated slavery on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. In the 17th century, there were quite a few free blacks in this area. In fact, it was the first blacks that came over here came over as more or less indentured servants from Africa, and they became members of a free black community that grew, so that at the time of the Civil War, the free black community was almost as large as the slave community.
So what kind of mobility did they have? What kind of freedoms did they have within this structure? Because there was still, as you were developing, a certain amount of obviously white supremacy and this idea that African Americans should be at least held in bay or controlled.
Okay. When you look at the African American community in the period before the Civil War, free blacks or slave blacks existed within the context of a total community. A total community is something that sociologists refer to as like a prison or a concentration camp or something like that. Even though blacks were free, they had to function within the context of this tight belt of racism, which limited mobility, which limited their entrance into the various occupations, which limited whether or not they could be out at night, whether they could attend meetings, whether they could even attend church revivals.
So one of the key elements in all of this is the ability to at least have some kind of employment, that kind of thing. What kinds of things were they allowed to do? What kind of restrictions were placed on them in terms of what they're able to do, certainly financially?
In the period before the Civil War, free blacks were intimately involved in the following trades. They were blacksmiths, they were barbers, they were small-time farmers. They worked on the waterfronts as stevedores. They worked in the lumber yards and shipyards. They worked in a variety of occupations.
So, in terms of the free blacks and even slaves, we obviously have the image of Paddy Cannon, whose gang often captured the free blacks, sent them to the South. What kind of industry was that in terms of people, if you were African American in particular, whether you were owned by somebody or not, perhaps owned by somebody, that you could get caught up in this thing? And I guess her trial eventually was sort of the trial of the century, or at least it was supposed to be.
Yes. Well, Paddy Cannon is an actual historical figure, and there were others like Paddy Cannon. They were called slave kidnappers, and they kidnapped free blacks or slaves and sold them off to the cotton fields of the plantation deep south. By and large, there were a lot of escape attempts by blacks from the farms and fields of the Eastern Shore because Pennsylvania was so close, and New Jersey was just a sail across Delaware Bay. So that there were numerous escapes from farms and communities down here on the Eastern Shore of blacks, and they were aided and abetted by Quakers, by anti-slavery people, and people like Harriet Tubman, who had a slave community in exile up in Canada, where free blacks could exist and prosper.
One of the things that you indicate that the slaves certainly carved out for themselves was the ability to have like work slowdowns, that kind of thing, in order to kind of push back on the demands of slavery. What about inside that slave context? How were these African Americans dealing with this?
Well, the master-slave relationship was a very complicated one. Tyrannical masters sometimes received severe pushback from their slaves in the form of barn burnings or haystack burnings, or horses that suddenly went lame because they were hurt by angry slaves. So there was a large measure of the ability to push back against tyrannical control. But what slaves could not do was they couldn't change the system per se.
So how did this relationship affect the white community? Because there was actually only a small portion, I guess, of the population on the shore, for that matter, or even in the South, that actually owned slaves. But nonetheless, you did have this caste system. As we move particularly towards the Civil War itself, what kind of relationship did whites see in terms of their African-American neighbors? I mean, did that change over time as we approach this kind of conflict that certainly was brewing within the United States?
There was very little change in the racial attitudes of people of Somerset County before the war. Whether or not you owned slaves, one participated in loyalty to the existence of a system of racial segregation that was to a great extent influenced by the fear of massive uprising. And after all, in 1831, you have the Nat Turner uprising. And there was always a fear that blacks would be rising against the white community. And so that fear and the knowledge that slavery and racism conferred numerous psychological and social privileges on the white community.
So I understand, by the way, I think you make reference to the idea that some people saw free Negroes or blacks as being accursed, at least in terms of Somerset County. That there was tell me a little bit about that. I mean, and this view of African American slavery from that white point of view.
Well, many whites saw the free black community as a curse, largely because blacks were infiltrating occupations that had traditionally been white in nature, such as blacksmithing, and working in shipyards as caulkers. Frederick Douglass, the noted black abolitionist, learned the trade of ship caulker in the Baltimore shipyards, and he relates that there was tremendous resentment against any kind of skilled black labor in the shipyards of Baltimore. And similarly, in the Eastern Shore, there was a great reluctance to allow blacks to enter skilled trades where they would develop a sense of autonomy and be able to control their own income.
So, of course, we come to 1861, the secession, the Civil War. What kind of role did the Eastern Shore play in all of that, and how did that affect the Eastern Shore, particularly when it came to this issue of slavery and race?
The Eastern Shore generally was a secessionist hotbed, especially Somerset County. And there were so many secessionists in Somerset County that an army of occupation had to come down into the county from the Union Army to sort of keep things under control.
In terms of the state legislature abolishing, I think it was slavery in 1864, how did the representatives of the Eastern Shore then react?
The representatives of the Eastern Shore reacted very badly to the emancipation of slaves. They fought it tooth and nail to the end. They were overwhelmed because Maryland had come under a new constitution during the Civil War era, and they were literally outvoted by anti-slavery representatives in the Maryland Assembly. And they constantly began looking for ways to keep slavery intact, even though it would not be called slavery in name.
And you have then John Crisfield, who takes a position he didn't really favor secession, although he favored slavery. I mean, and he had this interesting relationship, I guess, with Lincoln.
Crisfield was a very interesting character. He was a lawyer, a business promoter, a planter. He was the congressman from the 1st Congressional District, and he was a pro-slavery Union man. That is, he opposed secession but wanted to keep slavery, a position that became increasingly untenable as the war went on, and his position with Lincoln deteriorated in turn. The only compensated emancipation that took place during the Civil War took place in Washington, D.C., where the slave owners received $300 per slave as compensation for the loss of the use of the work of their slaves. But that's the only place. And the loss of slave labor on the Eastern Shore was very keenly felt in terms of the emotional and social impact.
And psychologically, he saw there's a choice between slavery and I think what you call the degradation, poverty, and suffering and extinction in terms of the African American. Tell me a little bit about that, because it does seem as if he's viewing slavery in this very positive light.
Yeah. After the Civil War, whites who had money on the Eastern Shore, especially in Somerset County, looked at first to have alternative sources of labor come in, and they imported, for example, large numbers of Irish Civil War veterans to build the railroad that went from Salisbury down to Crisfield. And the period after the war saw the development of apprentice laws that were aimed at keeping young black men to the age of 21 in some kind of permanent apprenticeship, which was little more than a kind of slavery reinvented.
And how did that work out? I mean, in terms of its length, in terms of its ability to keep African Americans in, what was the history, and how did they have to transition to other forms to keep people in check?
Well, after the war, there was an organization called the Freedmen's Bureau that was set up in the slave states, but it never worked very effectively on the Eastern Shore of Maryland because Maryland had never seceded. It was never part of the Confederacy, and so the impact of the Freedmen's Bureau was relatively minimal in Maryland compared to the impact of the Freedmen's Bureau in, say, Georgia or Mississippi. But slaves, former slaves, freedmen did complain to the Freedmen's Bureau about trying to get their children liberated from these harsh apprenticeship laws.
And were they ever successful?
Yes. They did succeed in some cases.
But generally not. Or do we know? I don't know. We may not know.
The record is unclear to me. That was an area of my research that I didn't go into.
Sure. So they also, by the way, I want to, before we get into the late 1800s, there also was this community of black watermen who seemed to have a lot more independence in many ways in terms of their ability to get around. Tell me, Linda, the growth of them in terms of the population.
Well, black watermen were a much more autonomous community than, say, blacks who tilled the land. Largely because, A, the work was hard and dangerous, and B, once you're out on the water, it was very difficult to control people's behavior. And they became a very independent force in black cultural life as oystermen and as fishermen. And after 1860, when the oyster boom took place because of the growing popularity of oysters, both in the United States and overseas, these blacks became economically quite self-sufficient and independent.
So one of the elements, I think, in African American life has always actually been the church, and it certainly grew in significance post slavery. What kind of role did that play in terms of the Eastern Shore?
Well, the church played a very prominent role in the black community on the Eastern Shore. In fact, the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, as it stands today, traces its roots back to the 1880s in its founding as a Methodist academy.
And in terms of the ability to mobilize people, were there prominent preachers then, or how did they?
Well, there were prominent preachers in the Delaware Conference who came down to set up schools for blacks in terms of teaching them how to read and write and develop a literate black community. And in this regard, Princess Anne Academy is a prime example of the kinds of work that was done largely as a biracial experiment in post-Civil War black freedom.
So I'm going to turn now to also separate but equal. How did that impact then the Eastern Shore as it spread across the country? And we obviously had Plessy versus Ferguson at the end of the 19th century.
Well, separate but equal really had a greater impact on the Eastern Shore after 1890 than during the period between 1876 and 1890. Between 1876 and 1890, after the failure of the apprenticeship system, blacks voted in elections. They ran candidates in the Republican Party. They got jobs in the Customs House in Baltimore. And it wasn't until the 1890s that newspaper journalists and editors and politicians began clamoring for a clampdown on black rights, and this largely was the result of the segregation of the period that lasted well into the 1960s and early 1970s.
Before getting into some of the more famous cases, what was the prevalence of lynching and other activities that perhaps led to death in terms of African Americans at the hands of whites, particularly during this period?
Yeah. Lynching was first and foremost a system of racial control. It was viewed on the Eastern Shore that unless there was a lynching every now and then, blacks would not be sufficiently subservient. Also, lynching was a product of essentially the sexual fears of the white community that somehow white women would be contaminated by aggressive sexually charged men. It was also a form of public spectacle and entertainment. When George Armwood was lynched in 1933, 2,000 people came to Princess Anne to witness the event. And throughout the 20th century, photographers would come to lynchings taking pictures of the black bodies hanging from the trees and put them on postcards so that people could send the postcards to their friends as sort of like a greetings from Princess Anne.
How does this account for this kind of outburst? Is it that the people, or as individuals, were able to participate, or is it that they were caught up in this mob, as it were, or what? Was there some psychological thing that you think held people together? I know, for instance, here in Salisbury, there was a lynching, obviously, Matthew Williams, in which, as I look at downtown Salisbury, it's where it occurred. It's a very small, intimate place. I mean, with a hotel that's right across the way where some African Americans actually worked and could look down and see what was happening. I mean, how did people get caught up in this?
Well, a lot of these lynchings occurred during very hard times economically. The Depression saw more than its share of lynchings, not only in Maryland but in the South generally. And During hard times, it's easy to look for scapegoats, and even though blacks were worse off than whites in most areas of the South, it was easy to blame black people for a lot of the angst that whites were suffering. And also, lynchings occurred during periods when it seemed like there was a considerable amount of black aspiration taking place in the community that people were fearful of. Recent research on the burning of an entire black town in Oklahoma in this period shows that there was tremendous resentment of black success economically and socially in the middle of the 20th century.
So I'm going to turn to George Armwood. What is the background? Are we certain then that he committed the kind of crime that he was accused of? And detail some of what happened there. Because he obviously he conspired actually with someone else.
Yeah. Well, the background of the lynching is fairly straightforward. There was a elderly white woman by the name of Mary Denston who walked back and forth between her home and her daughter-in-law's place, and she was known to carry sums of money in her bodice. In the 1930s, women carried money in their bodices, largely because people in those days were sort of skeptical of banks because a lot of the banks had failed and people had lost their savings, and where were they going to keep their money? So many women kept their money in their bodices, and George Armwood was persuaded by hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, persuaded by one of his employers to lurk in the woods and attack Mary Denston as she was coming home, and this 81-year-old woman put up serious resistance, and Armwood failed in his mission, fled, but she identified him, and he fled back to the house of John Richardson, a white farmer who was in conspiracy with Armwood, and soon the whole county was after George Armwood, and they captured his white Confederate and put him in jail, but they didn't lynch him. They lynched Armwood.
I mean, at one point, I think, was a judge that came out to sort of calm the crowd, as it were, even as it was gathering around. What kind of responsibility did folks like that, and for that matter, Governor Ritchie, have in all of this? Well,
one of the problems of the 1930s is that the social system on the Eastern Shore was changing, and that the old elites that had largely prevailed on the Eastern Shore and controlled things began to lose their influence. Judge Robert Doerr of the Circuit Court in Princess Anne thought that when a crowd assembled in front of the jail in Princess Anne, that all he had to do was to talk to them, tell them to mind their manners and go home, and they would listen to him. But that didn't happen at all. He went home, and I guess he was so confident that he had calmed the mob that he and his friends had a dinner party in his house. In the house, not his house, but the house of George Jarman. And lo and behold, while they were having their dinner party is when they broke into the jail and grabbed George Armwood and lynched him. And it wasn't just a lynching that is so despicable when we talk about the evils of lynching. And not only did they lynch George Armwood, but they mutilated him, they dragged him through the streets, they set his body on fire, and even to this day, psychologists are wondering why the excess. Wasn't lynching just enough? Why did they have to go through this whole process of mutilation? And it raises some very important psychosocial questions about the nature of white communities in the South during the 1930s.
Now, we also have Governor Ritchie, and he was, in fact, I think one of the newspapers, I think it was maybe the Baltimore Sun, suggested that one of the great failings was that he failed to act.
Well, you must bear in mind that as governor of the state of Maryland, he had only a limited power to control the political activities and autonomy of the various counties. And police down to get Armwood to move him from the county jail because it was feared that something terrible would happen to Armwood, and they moved him up to Baltimore. But the state's attorney, John Robbins, from Somerset County, petitioned in the courts, and Judge Doerr said that the autonomy of Somerset County is such that he had to be tried for these crimes in Somerset County. And so he was returned to the jail in Princess Anne, and when he was returned to the jail in Princess Anne, the crowd broke in and grabbed him and lynched him.
I want to now move to the civil rights era because we obviously have the riots that took place in the 1960s and certainly in Cambridge, wrap around and so on. But also Princess Anne was subject to conflict as well. Tell me a little bit about that and the background behind how obviously the Eastern Shore is beginning to react to these major changes that are taking place on a national level.
Well, you must bear in mind that in the 1960s, the agitation of the civil rights community was on every television set in America. It wasn't like before where these were isolated incidents that people could only read about in newspapers, which sometimes tended to downplay them. People watching the television and having their supper could see police and dogs attacking civil rights demonstrators. In 1963-64, a Princess Anne student by the name of John Winnersten led several hundred students into downtown Princess Anne to complain about the fact that there was no public accommodation for them. There was not a single place in the main town of Princess Anne where blacks could sit down and eat dinner. If they wanted something to eat, they had to go to the back end of the restaurant, press a buzzer, a window would open, and they would be given their meal to go. And so it was over this access to public accommodation that John Winnersten led. And the town panicked, called for the National Guard. The National Guard came, the state police came with dogs, and the local fire department with its volunteer all-white firefighting force opened up their hoses on the students, and it was a real mess. And unfortunately, for the segregationists, this got national attention, and it was a good move on the part of the civil rights agitators. And John Winnersten became a local leader, and he ultimately went on to a very illustrious career in politics in Washington, D.C., becoming president of the D.C. City Council prior to his death.
So, in terms of the white community, how did it come to grips or accommodate this change that took place in Princess Anne in terms of the restaurants and so on?
A lot of them didn't. Few restaurants opened up a little bit, but there was a great amount of hostility. On the Eastern Shore, many people wore pins that said, these were pins that they purchased that said never on them. And one of the leading segregationists in Maryland was a former president of the University of Maryland system, Curly Byrd, who was from Crisfield, and he didn't want to see the colleges of the state of Maryland integrated, and a lot of people took their cue from him.
So as we look at Princess Anne and Somerset County now, how do you assess where they are in all of this? Obviously, you're in D.C. now, so you're looking sort of a bit far away, but what sense do you get in terms of the people you're talking to?
There's a kind of calm now in Somerset County, racially speaking. I think that the election of the first black county commissioner was a very salutary development, as is the current election of people to the city council, blacks to the city council. But that doesn't necessarily mean that things have changed. That people still have in their hearts what they had learned over the years, and although they're not talking about it, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have changed that dramatically. Let me give you an example. A while back, the last white class of Washington High School had a reunion to celebrate the good old days of Washington High School. And of course, no blacks from that year were invited to reunion because they had their own separate high school system at that time. And it was really noticed as a major insult in the black community. And also, when Somerset County finally got a black superintendent, he didn't last very long before he was fired, and it was litigated in the courts, and Dwayne Whittington, the black former superintendent, won his case, saying it was pure unmitigated racism that resulted in his dismissal as superintendent of schools of Somerset County.
Well, we've been speaking with Jack Winnersten. He is a curator consultant at the Smithsonian Institution, as well as emeritus professor at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Also has written now a new book examining the issue of race entitled Strange Fruit, Racism and Community Life in the Chesapeake from 1850 to the present. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.